Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. You are in the right place if you're here for the Advocate, Connect, and Engage session. My name is Corinne Hodges. I'm the CEO of the Association of Women's Business Centers, and it is truly an honor and a pleasure to have you here today. We're about to dive into something pretty heavy and pretty exciting, so put on your Zoom seatbelts because we're hoping that today is a journey for you. It's the beginning of a really important journey together. Whether you are here as one of our A.C.E grantees or whether you're here as a women's business center in the field, welcome. We know that when an aspiring or existing woman business owner comes to you for help, she's looking for change. And it's not the kind of change she's able to bring about herself, or she would have done it already. She's coming to you because she knows you can help her. She may need funding, or she may need a know-how, but she already believes in you and she trusts you. She's knocking on your door and she's asking for help. You, as her champion and as her community advocate, are in a perfect place to help her. And so as she progresses on her journey, she's hitting her goals and she realizes that with your help, she's been able to overcome many hurdles in her business. And regrettably, some of these hurdles she may not have had to confront. Some of the hurdles she's overcoming are just regular business growth pains. But we know that she will have encountered some form of environmental, social, or bureaucratic barrier that could easily be resolved with change. And so since she trusts in you and she comes to you, we know that if you told your client that you could help amplify her voice to advocate for the women like her that will come behind her, she would listen to you, and she's likely to want to engage in sharing her voice and advocating for that type of change. So we know because of this, women's business centers are in the perfect position to broaden the work you're already doing to advocate for women in your communities, to advocate for your clients, to help them and us to make positive and long-lasting change. Women of every community have the right to raise their voice, and they're already looking to you for help. That is why we, in partnership with the Kauffman Foundation, developed the Association of Women's Business Centers Advocate, Connect, and Engage program, also known as ACE. This 12-session curriculum will teach you all, specifically women's business centers for this session, how to work with women entrepreneurs to engage in advocacy at the local, community, or even federal level. And the curriculum provides you with knowledge and resources to train women-owned small business clients on the processes and the techniques around effective advocacy, key policies and legislation, regulation, and just state-specific opportunities and information that are relevant to you. And we know that when you speak, Washington listens. So we have lots of evidence of this over the last 20 or so years of the life of the Association of Women's Business Centers. Policymakers at all levels inform their decisions by listening to you as their constituents to help them craft legislative policies to solve problems. So our goal for this curriculum is to strengthen the voice of women entrepreneurs, empowering them and engaging them with their representatives, and with you as women's business centers, teaching them every step of the way through this journey in your communities. So while we're providing very specific policy guidance in some cases, we know that you obviously see firsthand what those unique barriers are, those unique issues impacting your clients, especially women entrepreneurs in your local communities, and you'll have a chance to affect those specific systems. As a fundamental resource for women entrepreneurs in your area, it's critical to properly prepare and encourage your clients to engage in the solutions that are oriented to affect long-lasting change. So now is the time. Now is the time to amplify the voice of women entrepreneurs for change. It's our responsibility to advocate on behalf of all women entrepreneurs that we serve. Even more importantly, we must educate them how to advocate for themselves so that they can make their own voices heard. So we look forward to engaging with you in this program with each and every one of you. And we look forward to empowering you and to empowering women entrepreneurs nationwide for long-lasting change. At this time, I'd like to introduce your next speaker, Jessie Yankee. So the podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I just want to echo everything Corinne said, and I hope that you all are feeling inspired. I know you're excited about this training because so many of you registered and are with us here today. So welcome. Welcome to the first session of many sessions of the Advocate, Connect, and Engage, or ACE program. This curriculum is being designed as a train the trainer model that will help you educate your entrepreneurs, but also educate you. I know from my experience, as well as many of my conversations with all of you, that many of you are yearning for more education on advocacy yourselves. So this curriculum will work through all of that for you, and then for you to go on and teach the clients you serve how to advocate, as Corinne talked about. So we can go ahead and move on to looking at an overview of what we are going to cover today. First, we will introduce the full ACE team, as well as introduce you to the grantees that have been selected as part of the ACE program. Again, this education series is open to all WBCs. You don't have to be an ACE grantee to participate. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. We are going to talk about what advocacy is and what political advocacy is, and a lot of the recent impacts that we've had in our advocacy efforts with your help so far. We're going to go over an overview of the curriculum as it stands now and where the curriculum is going. This is going to be a curriculum that is a living, breathing document and toolkit that we continue to develop well into the future, and we'll talk about that later. We're going to talk about some federal government basics. That was a personal request. So if you're sitting here going, I don't know the first thing about advocacy, I don't really understand some of the inner workings of federal government, we're going to cover a lot of that in this curriculum as well. We're going to go into things that are really relevant for you guys right now, which is ARPA and SSBCI. So get excited for that. And then lastly, how to better position your Women's Business Center and your entrepreneurs in this role. So as we go along, feel free to use the Q&A functionality within Zoom. You can also, of course, reach out to us at any time. I'll be your main contact for the ACE program. And again, that's open to all, regardless of being an ACE grantee or not. So let's go ahead and meet the team. Starting with Corinne, you already have met this morning, and myself at AWBC. You're also going to see on the slide, and Ashlyn, if you want to go ahead and move on to the slide 3, that would be great. Oh, there you go. So you can also see the 9 projects that were selected as the first cohort of ACE grantees. Very exciting. This group does represent 35 women's business centers across 11 states. So an incredible group across the nation to kick off our first ACE cohort. And then also I'd like to turn it over back to Corinne to talk about PRISM and our longstanding relationship between PRISM and the AWBC. So go ahead, Corinne.
Yeah, thank you so much. So AWBC, as far as I know, in the entire history of the organization, has had 2 lobbying firms. The first one, frankly, I don't know the name. This was long before I came along. Did a great job for us. But the principal of that company, or that organization, she eventually retired. And John Stanford at PRISM, he trained up, he worked under her for many years on the AWBC account. And so he eventually set up his own firm in partnership with some partners, and they've had the AWBC account ever since. So PRISM Group is an organization who has super long history with AWBC, who knows women's business centers, and quite frankly, the small business lobbying and legislative community better than anyone else. They've got offices that services that address not only the federal level, but also the local level. So John Stanford has been just even though he looks young, he's really a seasoned executive with a long history with us. And Ashlyn and Olivia are more recent wonderful additions to the team who we really work with on a day-to-day basis.
Great. And then Ashlyn, I know you wanted to introduce a little bit more about PRISM since you are such a key component to this program.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jesse. So for those of you that we have not met, PRISM Group is a bipartisan government affairs and strategic communications firm, and we specialize in assisting corporations and sovereign governments, nonprofits, and trade associations really navigate the complex legislative and regulatory environment. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., so we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill and in various agency offices, and we engage policymakers and high-level influencers, really just working to get the best intelligence for everything as it relates to small business, the women entrepreneurial community, and really offer kind of strategic guidance on receiving the best outcome. So we've, as Corinne had mentioned, we've worked with AWBC for many years, and are really thankful for John's leadership there. And we're excited about this project just because through our work, we've had countless fly-ins, and for those of you guys that have been participating in our fly-ins, we thank you for dedicating your time. And I think you guys are the first to say that policymakers really want to hear from you. We can talk all day long in Washington, but you guys really have that valuable trifecta where you are often constituents. If not, you help support and provide counseling to constituents. You have anecdotal stories, and third, to round out that great trifecta, is that you have data. And those are all really key components that policymakers care about. So with that, I'd like to quickly introduce Olivia Lucani. She is our Senior Associate of the State Affairs team. There you go. There's Olivia. So you'll be seeing her face as well during the duration of this program. She will be providing some more of those state guided sessions. And then as Corinne mentioned, John Stanford, our managing partner as well, that I believe many of you guys have been able to meet over the years. With that, I'll turn that back over to you.
Thank you so much. And again, just a congratulations to the WBCs you do see listed here for participating in the first round of our ACE grant. Also during this advocacy series, we're going to welcome many guest speakers from the WBC field. There are some WBCs doing tremendous work in this area already who have some best practices that they want to share with you all. So we will welcome some familiar faces from the WBC network as well. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that everybody on this call, as well as your clients, is somewhere different in their advocacy journey. Some information presented today or in future courses may be basic to some of you, but in an effort to create this true grassroots advocacy curriculum that is understandable and attainable by everyone we serve, we're going to start with the basics. So the curriculum, like I mentioned, and the toolkit development are going to be a living, breathing resource that will grow alongside of us this first year of education. So from that, we really will welcome and ask for feedback and input from all of you for additional areas you would like to see or other clarifications you would like based on things you see throughout the course. So we can go ahead now and move into what is advocacy? What does it mean? And why is it important? And so advocacy is standing up for and defending something or someone you believe in. So WBCs, as we know, are a huge advocate for the clients we serve. Now every single one of you may have engaged in advocacy where you were standing up for an issue or something you believe in to raise awareness. Example of this could be shown in the form of a rally, participating in a social media campaign, engaging in another form of organized effort. For example, you may remember when we asked you all to get your clients to sign the letter calling for the reauthorization of our grant. So that was an advocacy effort. If you have not spoken out on an issue, you've probably supported someone or even yourself by becoming an advocate or a self-advocate. This often takes place in a scenario where an individual is not able to stand up for themselves. Many of you, I know, are thinking of a time where you advocated for a client with a landlord or a lender, for example. I know that I personally have done that. And before we dig too deep, I'd love for you to take a moment to think about a time where you believe you were being an advocate for someone or an issue, and take a moment to reflect on that and write that down, whether now or later, and about that experience and how that made you feel. So that is what we're going to be working on transferring to the clients that you serve. So that, just have that in the back of your mind, or if you have a piece of paper there, think about a moment where you truly felt like an advocate for someone. So identifying advocacy is important to your work as a women's business center leader and a civilian. And you might already, I know there's a few people on this call who are already frequent and loud advocates, but you may also see opportunities to engage in advocacy starting today. So now that we've classified what constitutes advocacy, why is it important? Do you have a story where someone spoke out on your behalf, or an issue that impacted you to invoke significant change? And how did that impact your life? Again, I'd like you to be thinking about that. And if you're willing, we'd love to take someone from the field who is willing to share their experience where someone advocated for them. And I think, is there a way to raise your hand, Karina?
Yep, you should be able to raise your hand if you have any questions, or use the Q&A feature.
And I don't want you guys to be shy through this curriculum, so please feel free to jump in or use the Q&A to share your story. So the sediment of creating and amplifying a voice where there is none is the sediment behind this program. And as WBC leaders, you have a voice and a responsibility to advocate for the women that you're serving at your center. And so with that, I'm going to move it on to Ashlyn to talk about political advocacy.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that really quality level set, Jessie. I think that political advocacy specifically is also where folks are engaging the government, which can be at the federal, state, local level, really just to similarly convey their viewpoint and ultimately facilitate change. So even as Corinne mentioned in her introductory remarks, policymakers really do inform their decisions and policies that later become statute based on the information that they hear from you guys and the feedback that they hear from their constituents. As AWBC's advocacy team, we really approach political advocacy in 3 buckets. One would be raising visibility and building political capital. 2 would be looking at short-term priorities and what's possible, because as you guys are well aware, the government takes forever. And then 3, those longer-term really priorities to make substantive change in the long run. And so to kind of take a quick look back before we look forward, I'd love to quickly provide some recent milestones that we really have been able to achieve due to advocacy work at the national level. So AWBC has actively engaged in like-minded coalitions. That's a very viable way to provide thought leadership, and being an active member of the Small Business Roundtable and co-founding the Page 30 Coalition. So we really have been working to build that visibility and build the Women's Business Center voice on the national scale. Within that short-term priorities bucket, an example that directly points to the importance of advocacy that you all may remember is the inclusion of the WBC program in the CARES Act, which became law in 2020. As a reminder, the CARES Act, Corona Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, provided record high funding for WBCs to accommodate for that COVID influx, which was about 23 million in core funding and 48 million through CARES dollars. And it really amounted to a total of about 420,000 per Women's Business Center on average. And in addition, the Act waived the vital WBC matching fund requirement during the bulk of the COVID pandemic as well. And so these 2 really substantive changes to the program even as brief as they may have been, enabled WBCs to survive and really serve a record number of small business owners over the pandemic. And so even according to data that we've received from OBO, WBC served 87,852 unique clients in 2021, which was an increase in 6.5% from the 82,466 unique clients served in 2020, and an even greater increase from the previous year. The work of our advocacy team with federal policymakers made the additional funds and waiver extension possible. And since our voice was accounted for, we were in mind when solutions were discussed and legislation was created. Under the long-term priorities bucket, our goal remains to reauthorize the WBC program and make long-lasting change to support women entrepreneurs. And of course, we have a session on that later in this curriculum, and we look forward to diving in deeper there.
Yeah, and just a little off script, Ashlyn, can you just speak to what it means to reauthorize the Women's Business Center program? Absolutely.
And so the Women's Business Program has not been authorized in over 20 years, which is incredible, especially if you think about how different our world is today than it was about 20 years ago when it was last reauthorized in statute. And so ultimately, reauthorization is an avenue to modernize and update the WBC program in statute. And so currently, we have been advocating for reauthorization for a couple years. And of course, the WBC program is able to be active. And of course, we keep working despite this lack of reauthorization, but really this reauthorization kind of creates the parameters of the program. And so things like the WBC match and those items that are really ingrained in statute comes into play within this reauthorization.
Thank you so much. I know that from the field, I would have not known what that actually meant. And I know we're going to talk more about that important, probably our favorite thing to talk about in terms of policy priority regarding reauthorization on a future call. So as you know, why is this not a one and done deal? And why do we always have to be working on advocacy? As you know, there's frequent turnover, right? Congressional administrative turnover every few years. And that's why continued advocacy is vital for these important issue areas. The high turnover for policymakers and the staff that support them means that continued educations about the WBCs and what we do is needed to ensure that the decision makers are well equipped. I mean, I know I can't see you all, but I guarantee if I said, how many of you have been in a room with a legislator and they'd never heard of a Women's Business Center? Every single one of you would raise your hand. We see it frequently. And that's, again, why this is so important that we're working on this project together. Because you as Women's Business Center leaders have the unique voice as the support system for so many entrepreneurs in your area. Through this curriculum, we will ensure that you are all well equipped to teach the same entrepreneurs you serve how to become advocates for themselves and speak up for the key issues that all entrepreneurs face. And then most importantly, policymakers at all levels, local, state, federal, they all want to hear from you. I know for me, in my past, I would have said, they don't care about what I have to say. They don't want to know what my opinion is about something, but that's not the case. They do want to hear from their constituents at every level. And grassroots engagement is going to connect those individuals they want to hear from in your communities to them via in-person events, letters, hosting your representative at events, opportunities for testimony, and all types of things that we're going to talk about as part of this curriculum and best practices. So this is not a political issue. We're not doing this training based on one issue. This is an evergreen, nonpartisan effort that impacts all entrepreneurs well into the future. So let's talk about what the curriculum is going to look like for this first year, so you have an idea of what's to come. It's structured so that you're going to learn about the advocacy process and techniques. We're going to explore, on average, a topic a month, and you can see on your screen the list of all of the areas we're going to cover just in this first year. There is going to be 10 sessions like this one, and then we're going to be doing some state-specific sessions as well. So we'll talk about that on a future call. Also, in addition to the advocacy topics, the curriculum is on average going to include a key policy or piece of legislation a month out of our policy priorities. These will also be tied back to the Kauffman Foundation as well. So we're very grateful to have them as a partner on this program. And the reason we're all in this room today is because of the Kauffman Foundation. So thank you. Let's see, the policy specific topics that we're going to explore are also on the screen, but that includes ARPA and SSBCI, all of which are super relevant to you right now, I'm sure. The reauthorization legislation we mentioned earlier, things like appropriations and continuing resolutions, sure as heck didn't know what those were before this either. So we're going to go into all the details on all of those items. Things like CRA, you all are familiar with CRA to some extent from your funders, but we're going to talk more about that and the Improvement Act of CRA that's currently being worked on. So some important dates, as you all know, we're going to be together next week at the Leadership Conference, yay! And then also in March 23, we'll have a fly-in. And I wanted to speak to that because Ashlyn did mention the fly-in earlier, and I realized we have lots and lots of new WBCs on this call and might not know what a fly-in actually is. And what it is where we congregate in DC and go to the offices and speak to the legislators in person or virtually like we did last year. These are incredibly effective times. So look for information on the 2023 fly-in coming soon. Also, throughout the curriculum, you're all going to be provided with handouts to work through in real time. So like I mentioned earlier about writing down that moment that you felt like an advocate or where someone advocated for you, we'll actually have some materials to go along with our sessions for you to follow along and fill in answers. All of those will be compiled after the sessions to be used into the future as we continue to work on our curriculum. We'll also send surveys after each of the sessions to assess how you think it went, and then of course to provide that much needed feedback on things you'd like to see or more clarification that you need on an item. And then following the completion of this first year, we will provide everyone a toolkit that is made up of handbooks from each sessions and the best practices packets of engaging legislators for you to then also provide to your clients. And again, this is ongoing. We are going to be doing this well into the future. So I look forward to that. The handbook is going to be a turnkey item in this curriculum and for your entrepreneurs. So with that, we're going to move. I can pause if there's any questions. I see Karina sending a test message, but I wanted to make sure there was nothing I needed to address now, and it doesn't look like it. But I am going to turn it over to Ashlyn to start talking about the basics of the federal government. So take it away, Ashlyn.
Thanks so much, Jessie. What a great question. The basics of the federal government. So to provide a fundamentals refresh and to reiterate what Jessie had mentioned earlier, you may be aware of some of this, but this really is to provide kind of a 101 level set and for us to kind of go from there as this session progresses. So the federal government is, of course, composed of three distinct branches. That's made up of the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, whose powers are upheld by the U.S. Constitution, in the Congress, the president, and federal courts. And so first and foremost in this first bucket is the legislative branch, and the legislative branch makes the laws. This includes Congress, which is comprised of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they write, create laws, and they vote on legislation. And they do all of kind of the grunt work of what becomes later statute and what everyone is upheld to. And so Congress itself, I mentioned the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So what are those? Dig in a little deeper. At first, the Senate, it's made up of 100 senators with 2 elected senators per state. And the Senate term is 6 years, and there's no limit to the number of terms an individual can serve. The second of the two, the House of Representatives, is made up of 435 elected representatives, and that is divided among the 50 states in proportion to their total population. There are also additional non-voting delegates that represent the District of Columbia, for example, where I sit, and territories like Puerto Rico, where this year's AWBC conference is being held. A representative serves a 2-year term in the House of Representatives, and there is also no limit to the number of terms an individual can serve there. Moving on to the executive branch. Of course, once a law is created, then it'll go to the executive branch to carry out the law. So key roles of the executive branch include the president, who leads our country, and he serves 4-year terms and can be elected no more than 2 times. The vice president, who really his role is to support the president, and if the president is unable to serve, the vice president would become president. And the vice president can be elected to serve for an unlimited number of 4-year terms as vice president, even under different heads of state. And then the third bucket within the executive branch is the cabinet. So the cabinet really serves as advisors to the president. They include the vice president, the heads of executive departments, and other high-ranking officials. And cabinet members are nominated by the president and must be approved by a simple majority of the Senate. And whenever we reference simple majority, that means since there's 100 senators in the Senate, that would be 51. And when we reference cabinet officials and heads of executive departments, those would be, the head of the SBA or the head of the U.S. Department of Treasury. So those are selected by this office. And then finally, just to wrap up kind of the high level before we dig in a little bit deeper, to briefly touch on the judicial branch. This branch is tasked with evaluating the laws and is really made up of the Supreme Courts and other courts, and they interpret the meaning of the laws, applying laws to individual cases and deciding if laws, whether or not they violate the Constitution. All right, so when we are looking at the federal government and kind of going back to the legislative branch. So that's where we spend a lot of our time, because we really try to make kind of upstream change, which takes place in that legislative branch. And so folks that we engage in, and we've engaged in for years and continue to, is the committees within the federal Congress. And so for a bill to be introduced, it typically has to be introduced by a relevant committee that has jurisdiction over the issue. And so an example there would be the House Committee on Small Business or the Senate Committee on Small Business. They hold the jurisdiction over the WBC reauthorization legislation that we've referenced previously. On a piece of legislation that is introduced in the committee, of course, we need to identify a champion in order to draft the legislation and introduce it. And then once it's introduced, we really need to have some champions really push it through for additional co-sponsorship. And ultimately, we go for bipartisanship as well. And once a piece of legislation is introduced in either committee, it needs to be approved out of this committee to be then brought to the floor. And so the floor is being voted on the Senate, on the House or Senate floor. And so the floor is how a bill is to actually become a law. And so once it's brought to the floor, it can be voted on and passed through the chamber. And so once it's voted on and passed through the chamber in one of the chambers, remember there's 2, the House of Representatives, for example, the exact same process has to go and happen in the Senate. And so if you can tell, this is a lot of steps, but ultimately once a bill is introduced out of committee, introduced to the full chamber, has enough votes, is able to be voted on and passed in both chambers, then it comes to a process where the 2 chambers need to negotiate if there's any discrepancies between the 2 bills, to then produce one final legislation that they would send to the president's desk to become law. Other key committees that I'd just like to highlight on this section would be the appropriations committees. And I know that we'll be digging into that more so in a later session, but very quickly, These committees have jurisdiction over all discretionary spending legislation and are tasked with authorizing funding amounts each year as well. So how does the federal government compare to the states? It's a great question. Under the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution, all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved for the states and the people. All states governments are modified after this federal government structure and consist of 3 branches, which include the executive, legislative, and judicial, as I'd mentioned previously, although this 3-branch structure is not required. So in that case, each state really is unique, even though many often fashion themselves after the federal government. They are unique in structure and also their schedules as well for when they are in session and when they are not. So we will be having, of course, future sessions that focus on each specific state for the grantees and how this is directly impacting your state. But as I had mentioned, each one is very unique and specific. So tips on addressing federal and state legislators, what's the difference? At all levels of government, I think it's really important to keep in mind that these individuals are well-respected elected party members and reference and need to be referred to by their title. And so even though if you are able to become such good friends with them and then, you know, they tell you to call them by their first name, that's fantastic. But up until that point, holding them with the utmost respect and holding them to their titles is fundamentally crucial. And so those titles can be, of course, representative, senator, delegate, governor, etc. But in future sessions, of course, we'll go into the proper terminology when you're addressing your specific delegations at both the federal and state levels.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Ashton, I'll just jump in for a second. I know you guys are probably already like, whoa, okay, yeah. I mean, it does get serious quick. And I know that when you are providing this information to your clients, that you will need some materials that outline this for you, which we will provide. So we don't expect you to remember everything Ashlyn just said. It's for your knowledge, and we will prepare very readable, easily understandable, templated materials for you to use with your clients in this program. So I just wanted to mention that.
Absolutely. And these recordings, these are going to be recorded as well to refer back to at any point.
Absolutely.
Jesse. And so with that, I think that was a great transition into what is the serious topic of ARPA, the American Rescue Plan. So now that we've given you guys a lay of the land, I think it's time to explore the recent piece of legislation and its related programs and policies from the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And so as Jesse had mentioned, if you guys want to take a moment, or if you guys would like to submit anything in the Q&A, we'd love to hear if you've heard of ARPA, if you know anything about it, and kind of help us.
If you've already submitted a grant request, things like that.
Exactly. So help us really kind of determine where you guys fall in that process. Mm-hmm. But to provide a very overview level set to start out with on ARPA, this legislation became law in March of 2021. And is a $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package designated to facilitate the U.S. recovery of the pandemic. And so this actually is a monumental piece of legislation, if you've heard it referenced many times, because it's one of the most expensive legislative packages in U.S. history. So it's definitely going to go into the history books for our children and their children after that. This package really follows the other 2 COVID stimulus packages, like the CARES Act that we had mentioned earlier, and also the nearly $900 billion stimulus included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. So for ARPA, if you recall benefiting from the $1,400 stimulus payment over the pandemic, then congrats, you've benefited from ARPA. The ARPA provided that, along with, of course, tranches of funding, but that stimulus check was one component of it. ARPA provided $350 billion in financial relief for state and local governments also affected by the COVID pandemic. And this legislation really created an influx of dollars for many state and local communities as well. And so kind of within that $350 billion bucket for additional funding for state and local governments included the state funding portion that was at about $195 billion, with about $25.5 billion distributed equally among the 50 states and DC, to local funding, which would be about $130 billion equally divided between cities and states, and then 3 for cities, about $65 billion divided between jurisdictions that are community development block grant entitled jurisdictions, and also those that are not entitled as CDBG entitlements. So to kind of dig into those a little bit further, that state funding, as I mentioned, $195 billion is distributed equally among all 50 states and DC, relying on a formula that calculates the individual's state's unemployed population, where this funding allows communities that have encountered losses due to the COVID pandemic, such as detriments of labor opportunities in the working class, to really rebuild with the state's reinforcement. So states have until December 31st of 2024 to obligate all of the funds that they have received through this SSBCI dollars, and they have until 2026 to finish spending all of that amount. And so I'll go ahead and take a pause there just to make sure that that sinks in a little bit more. What is all of this ARPA funding? Is all of it used? I think it's really crucial that a key takeaway of today be that the states that are receiving these ARPA dollars, they have until the end of 2024 to allocate this funding. And so some states may have not allocated some portions of this funding. And that is why conversations like this is so critical, to be able to go to your state legislators and ask. And then also to underscore, once they have to commit their funding in 2024, they don't have to actually pay it out until the end of 2026. All right, to keep moving along, county funding is at approximately $65 billion and is allocated based on the county's population as well. And within that tranche of funding, $45 billion will be allocated based on the community development block grant jurisdiction as well. Local funding will be evenly divided between cities and counties, and localities receive their funding according to a two-pronged system. The first, after the US Treasury had certified it, and then the second one, which was a year later, which was in May of 2022. And then finally, city funding, of course, the $65 billion is divided between those same CDBG and non-CDBG jurisdictions, and with a focus on metropolitan cities as well. All right, so after throwing all of that at you guys,
let's just pause. Let's pause there for a second. So okay. I know what you're thinking is trying to understand where ARPA is at in your state. And if you have specific questions about your state, we are happy to address those. And I want you to reach out to us about that. You also might be thinking this information is a little too late in some states. I know, for example, in my state, the ARPA funding for small businesses either just closed or is close to closing. And also why we are so passionate about this, I'm going to give another example of the small business grant through ARPA that was available locally where I live was a reimbursable grant, okay? So what that means is the client has to have $50,000 on hand to pay for the items and then be reimbursed, or go do something like get a line of credit. Now, as we all know, as Women's Business Center leaders, that is not a feasible method for the vast majority of clients that we serve. And so it's important for us to begin this journey of advocacy so that our voices and our client voices can be at the table when decisions like that process are being made. And that's just one of, hundreds, if not thousands of micro transactions or decisions that are being made without our client voices involved. So we realize that across your states, you're in all different areas with ARPA right now. And again, if you're looking for help or support in your accessing your ARPA dollars, we're happy to talk about that offline and specific to your area. So that's all I wanted to add, Ashlyn.
That is really helpful. And I just wanted to take a moment to also see that we're seeing some things coming through the Q&A. So we appreciate that. I think that's our version of the chat for today. So please continue to be putting things there. And Catherine, we see your note on the CDBG grant. I think that's very useful information for even us to know what folks have been approached at all. And then also with Nancy, to your point on the 65 billion going to focusing on metro areas, there's a portion of that that's focused on metro areas, but also not all of it. And so there's definitely a designated portion also for rural communities, since that remains a key priority this congressional session as well.
Yeah, so those items that frustrate you are exactly why we are doing this program. And we'll be working on this. Well, this is not going to be a quick journey. This is something we're all committing to into the long term, to inch by inch get the voices into a more equitable way for these monies to be distributed in the future.
And to the last question I just saw pop in to Sarah, I think that Sarah Vesio, thank you for that. She asked, did we reach out to our state Senate members or assembly members to find out if ARPA has been fully committed? That is exactly the premise of this ACE program, is that each individual in each state, I think that is a key takeaway of some activity that we can have in kind of facilitated communication with your state and local governments in order to see that committed funding and what is available.
So the way this plays out for those of you on the call, we're going to get through the training today. And then what we can take away as an action item as a community of, women's business centers and entrepreneurs is build a template letter, a campaign, basically. So if y'all are interested in doing this ARPA campaign, we all write letters, we all get our small business clients to sign on to it, and we demand, to know how those funds have been distributed. So anyway, today's the create awareness about the opportunities. And then as we move forward through the cycle, you're going to see these opportunities to get engaged. So while we're going to be moving on for today, I don't want you to think that this is all this is just education. We're going to touch on the topics and then move on and not actually do anything. That's not true. So just so you know, there's more coming on the action items.
Thank you, Corinne.
Thanks, Corinne. And so with that, we can dig in a little bit deeper into ARPA and touch on SSBCI. And so, of course, the ARPA reauthorized and amended the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010, which was the initial SSBCI statute under the Obama administration, and provides $10 billion to fund SSBCI as response to the COVID pandemic as well. And I think it would be helpful just to kind of provide a little bit additional background. So under the Obama administration, SSBCI was in place from 2010 until 2017. And it was their response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And so this kind of initial version of SSBCI had delivered about $1.5 billion to states and generated over $10 billion of investment. And so basically ARPA is just kind of revitalizing this same program into modern day. And so the goal of SSBCI is really to have job creation and increase capital to help small businesses and be able to create more opportunities, to promote equity as well, to increase wages, and then really to help lift tides in key industries. And so high level numbers that I know, of course, are listed up here. $6 billion to states, territories in Washington, D.C., $500 million to tribal governments, of course, $1.5 billion to jurisdictions for businesses, enterprises owned and controlled socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, I think that's a key one to take a look at because women entrepreneurs fit within that bucket very nicely. $500 million to jurisdictions for very small businesses, defined as a business with fewer than 10 employees, which many of the clients that we serve are, including independent contractors and sole proprietors. 1 billion in additional incentive allocations to jurisdictions that demonstrate robust report for SETI businesses. And to wrap it up, $500 million to provide technical assistance to certain businesses applying for SSBCI or other government programs. So what is the point of these dollars? You might be asking if you haven't heard of them and you're not even sure really what this is. So the point is that SSBCI funding is meant to expand capital, promote economic resiliency, and create jobs and really increase economic opportunity while focusing on expanding opportunities within the underserved community, especially those that are lacking capital and lacking kind of those existing financial ecosystems that support them up for success. And so to dig in a little deeper on kind of what each of the components of SSBCI are, we will quickly go through a little bit more detail here. So SSBCI funds really kind of are broken out into funds for capital programs and funds for technical assistance programs. The SSBCI funds will be used to support for capital programs will be used to support small businesses financing programs and the provisions of the we're gonna reset. Sorry about that. The SSBCI funds for capital programs is the broken down into kind of 5 different buckets. And so those include the capital access programs, the loan participation programs, loan guarantee programs, collateral support programs, and venture capital programs. And so to give you a little bit more detail on each of those 5 programs within this kind of capital access bucket, venture capital programs are jurisdictions that could be set up through private public partnerships for equity investing or investing in venture capital funds. And these investments are really focused on providing capital to underserved startups and democratizing venture capital across geography and diverse founders. That the loan participation programs really focuses on programs in the states, DC, territories, and tribal governments to be able to buy an interest in the loans that are made by lenders or lend directly alongside private lenders, promoting direct lending to finance small businesses. The loan guarantee programs are really intended to provide an assurance to lenders that will be partially repaid in the event of default after a lender makes every reasonable effort to collect, helping small businesses, of course, the goal in securing loans and that may have been otherwise inaccessible. Those collateral support programs or programs in this are used to really set aside funds as collateral for new loans. And so enabling new startups and to borrow these funds and help their businesses grow with the assistance of this SSBCI capital. And then to wrap up those loans within this kind of capital programs bucket is the capital access programs, referred to as CAPS. And these are programs that provide portfolio insurance in the form of a loan loss revenue fund in which the lender and the borrower contribute, supplemented with SSBCI funds. So that's a lot, but that's under the capital programs. And as Jesse had relayed, we will make sure that we have all of these resources for you if you'd like to kind of read up more, and are available for follow-up to kind of dig in more there on kind of the technical aspects of each of them.
And how their clients can access these tools. I mean, I know I'm speaking for the field, but I know they're saying, how does our client access these programs if they are lacking collateral or other issues? So we will send out the materials regarding these programs following this call.
Absolutely. And so that second bucket underneath the SSBCI is technical assistance. And so under this bucket, who's eligible? The states, DC, and territories, of course, that submitted this application. And so that they're allotted a certain amount of money. We're all eligible to receive funds for these technical assistance dollars. The award amounts underneath this bucket were 200 million of technical assistance funding to eligible recipients. And of that, about 185 million went to states, districts, and territories, and about 14 million went to tribal governments. So something that's very notable for you all, especially as kind of in our follow-up and how we look to approach our policymakers, is the role of eligible technical assistance providers. And so an eligible technical assistance provider is outlined by this program, provides technical assistance services to eligible beneficiaries. It's an eligible recipient of this could carry out the technical grant program, or there could be subcontractors and subrecipients of this technical assistance grant award program as well. And so all of that being said is, who's a fantastic technical assistance provider? WBCs are wonderful resources as a technical assistance provider. And there is a significant chance that if you have not already been approached by your state, that even in their planning and allocating and applying for this funding at the federal level, that they may have kind of carved out a section for, oh, this will be for women entrepreneurs, but haven't yet decided on who that could be. And so that is technical assistance programs. So moving along to kind of who made the decisions for this SSBCI funding, like how does it work? So this is even though all of the states have been selected and all of these deadlines to apply at the state level, it has all passed. The SSBCI funds are dispersed through the Treasury, and they're dispersed at a rolling basis as well. And so even though all of it has been selected, we are knowledgeable of a significant portion of the amount of awards that have been made, but not necessarily all of them. And we continue to track that as that comes down the pipeline. And so just to kind of provide a quick visual of the National Committee of State Legislatures actually had a fantastic resource on this, and we'll include this in our kind of resources note as follow-up. But this is a visual representation of kind of each state that was able to receive funding, various tranches of funding. And then there's a certain number of funding that has been allocated, but there's also a certain amount of funding that the states have not yet dedicated the funding that they've been given to yet. And so I think that is a very important nuance to really pay attention to as we move forward. And I want to be sensitive of time, so I won't bore you guys by going through every single state and the allocated funding, but I have a very long list here and we can include it in follow up. But it really is useful to know where you fall in your state. And then also it's helpful to know which states are actively accepting applications for SSBCI as well. All right, and so how can we make sure women-owned small businesses are considered for this next round of funding? I think this is a crucial question that Jesse pointed to earlier. That does this make you mad that you didn't know about this 2 years ago when it was happening, to make sure that we were kind of in the forefront, in the tranche? And so that's really the purpose of this training. It's to prepare WBCs and women entrepreneurs for the next time that there is funding available to be utilized. And our goal is to increase awareness and understanding, both within our community, but then with policymakers, to make women-owned organizations the recipients of future funding and the funding and in future iterations of legislation as well. And so if you are feeling frustrated, that's why we really are going to be asking you guys to mobilize your clients and really uplift their voices, and to best prepare ourselves for this opportunity and future opportunities. A few things that could be helpful kind of moving forward, high level, is one, to make sure that you inform yourself about effective avenues to advocate through this program, which is a fundamental purpose of us getting together today and for our future sessions. 2, equip the entrepreneurs you serve with the necessary knowledge through this curriculum. 3, amplify the voices of the women entrepreneurs you serve with policymakers. And then 4, ultimately, this goal is to increase, as I mentioned, that awareness and understanding of the role of WBCs to keep you guys in the forefront of their minds when creating new legislation. If you guys, as we saw through CARES, if we're at the forefront, then we can be written into legislation and actually receive that downstream benefit. Now, you may be asking, how can we do this? We, of course, absolutely spend and dedicate a session to going into best practices, tips, and tricks in a future session. But for now, of course, some 3 high-level takeaways is engaging your members of Congress, is sending your members of Congress newsletters and reports and kind of keeping engagement there and keeping them apprised of what you're doing. And then a critical component is if you are to meet with them, if you are to engage with them, if you are to call them or send them a letter, just continue following up and send thank yous. Thank yous go a really long way in terms of the courtesy that Washington, the courtesy currency is what I like to call it in Washington. And so to reiterate how advocacy works, just keep in mind that WBC's inclusion in past legislation has been a result of this advocacy, and thanks to the advocacy done on behalf of AWBC and WBCs across the nation, WBCs will hopefully continue to be able to benefit from legislation. And this is because we'll continue to have a voice in the decision making. And with that, Jesse, I'll turn that back over to you.
Sure, and I realize we're at time, but we will stick around and finish a few things up. There was a question in the chat, does SSBCI have the same do by or use by terms as ARPA?
Yes.
Okay, so same timeline that the monies must be spent by 2026.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And so yeah, I want to say thank you, but if you're going, well, what do I do now? I would challenge you to go find out, if you don't already know or haven't participated in ARPA or what's happening with the SSBCI dollars in your state, that would be your homework, is to figure out where they're at in the process. And if you need help with that, that's where we are. This is not a see you later. It's a engage with us if you need help understanding what's going on in your state, and we will help you with that. So again, this was extremely high level. We're just getting started, and the full schedule of the entire advocacy series will be made available to you in the coming weeks. We're looking forward to talking more about this at the conference and every future conference, really. And we will provide all of these materials to you following the call. So with that, you are more than welcome to stay on, and we'll answer any questions you have. Otherwise, we will see you on the next call and also next week. Thank you guys. And thank you, Ashlyn and Corinne, for your participation today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see any more questions coming in just yet, but I did provide my email for any specific questions as well.
Thank you, guys. This was awesome. It was a great start.
In the vast world of advocacy.
And also, and since this was a ton of information too, just, yeah, if it's to take a moment and sit with it. And then, you know, as questions come up, we're always, absolutely always a resource.
Okay, no questions. Should I close it out?
I think so.
Okay, have a great day,
all.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.